Hello everybody, and welcome to How to Web Live episode 4. Transportation is one of the key industries in this world. If you think about all the things that you're using, all the goods that you are consuming, they've all been at some point subject to transportation. Whenever you walk out the door, you're using a transportation device or transportation infrastructure. And in the last decade, transportation has been massively impacted by technology. Whether it's taxi hailing apps like Uber or Lyft or many others, home delivery of groceries, but also we have companies like Flexport who are changing the way supply chain is operated across the world. And especially in the last 6 months, the pandemic has accelerated the rate at which technology is used in transportation. So today we'll be discussing technology meets transportation with two very special people. First of all, our guest today is Santosh Sankar, a partner at Dynamo Ventures. Dynamo Ventures is one of the very few funds who are specialized in investing only in supply chain and transportation startups, and it's based in Chattanooga, US, one of the major transportation hubs out there. Our host is Mihai Rotaru, who is the founder of Neobility and also a micromobility supporter. Previously, he founded CleverTaxi, who was a very popular taxi hailing app in Romania and was acquired by Daimler in 2017. So before kicking off, I want to say big thanks to Bitdefender for powering this series and empowering our internet experience safety. Here we go, How to Web Live episode 4. Santosh and Mihai, welcome.
Today's theme is micromobility, which is actually a theme very close to my heart personally, and also a current pursuit in my current company. Micromobility has made an impact on cities and communities around the world, but it was also impacted by COVID lately.
Great to be here. Thanks, Mihai.
Thank you for coming. So first of all, I'd just like to say for everybody who's joining us that we are taking live questions, and you can ask anything at any point in time, and we will just forward the question to Santosh. It's a great honor to have you here. Can you tell us a bit more about you and what Dynamo Ventures is about?
Sure. So we're an early stage fund, specifically a seed fund focused on supply chain and mobility. And along with that, we focus specifically around enterprise businesses. So we don't focus on business models that might be oriented specifically or solely towards B2C. With that, we invest around the world. So about a third of our funds are invested abroad and predominantly in Europe at that. And in order to kind of reinforce that, we have one of our 4 partners based in London, actually, and he tends to oversee that entire effort.
That's great. I mean, having a VC fund based in the US, but also active in Europe is a great opportunity for everybody looking at us right now to see a piece of your mind on how you view business on a global spread. So I'd like to ask you, on the theme today, what is your relationship with micromobility? Do you love it? Do you hate it? It's a complicated business, right?
It is. So as a consumer and as a user, I love micromobility. I bike to work whenever I can. It's a great form of recreation. If I need to get somewhere that's a short distance, I tend to default, especially when I'm traveling, to a bike share or a scooter share, or I'll even walk. But as an investor, we won't focus on the traditional micromobility networks. It's not within scope for us. But we do believe that it's a very important part of the broader mobility offering. We think micromobility is real. It's here to stay. Anybody who says otherwise, I'm skeptical of. And for us, the way we invest into the space is usually around offerings that can help the ecosystem or help the networks operate better. So about a year ago, we did an investment in a company called Token Transit. And what Token Transit is looking to do is provide the payment infrastructure for a multimodal experience, and specifically with public transit as well as the micromobility providers. So that was our key investment in the space. but we continue to be really intrigued by opportunities that help you load balance assets across the city, understand vehicle health, and also charging as well, since that's an important part of the operations.
Right. So I love that. So public transit and micromobility, basically multimodal solution. Then you probably also have a very good outlook on how the COVID impacted public transit and maybe also micromobility, maybe people's habits or even infrastructure in cities. What's your take on it?
Yeah. So here in the US, and we've seen this also in Europe, a lot of the public transit was grinding to a halt. There was a lot of skepticism around how things are being maintained, how they're being disinfected. If you're following the news, I think it was around June, July timeframe. There was a article on how New York City was cleaning the transit system, the subway system. Yeah. And I remember somebody asked me, but shouldn't they be doing that anyways? So it showed you that there's an effort that cities had to take to say, we're going to keep you safe. Equally, ride hailing also saw a plummet. We saw earlier this week, Uber said that they don't expect a full recovery there in the near future. And they're going to go multimodal. They're going to go wide in order to maintain their business and their operations. But interestingly, micromobility thrived. There's less risk of contact. These assets tend to sit out in the sun, right? So UV rays can also kill any virus that has not been necessarily disinfected. But also there's been a stronger push for owned micromobility. So I'm going to buy my own bike. I'm going to buy my own scooter and maintain it and use it for myself.
And that's a great point, right? Micromobility is, anything for the last mile, I guess, but it can be shared or owned. We have the two fastest companies in the history of startups to go unicorn were both micromobility, right? It was Lime and Bird, something like 14 months or something, just crazy. So it was seen as a very disruptive move. Has this amplified with the COVID? And how was the shift towards owned versus shared that you were addressing? And how do you see it going in the future? Is this a catalyst, or is this just, people moving to owning it and back to the old economy, but now it's micromobility instead of cars?
Yeah. So that's a broad question. So let me unpack it a little bit. I think that mobility is impacted heavily by the culture of a particular region or a particular country. Right. So here in the US, you tend to see in the Southeast, even in the Midwest, you have super large automobiles, so trucks, pickup vehicles that might traditionally be used for commercial purposes, but are also used for personal purposes. And there's a strong kind of a proud feeling of having a nice truck and keeping it well maintained. So depending on the region you're at, there has not necessarily been as much of a departure from traditional cars and vehicles. As you get into urban environments, there has been. It's generally very difficult to find parking, simply put, for a car. When you find it, it's likely expensive. So in a lot of tier 1 cities, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Washington, D.C., you see people kind of weaning off of an owned automobile. But what they're then doing is they're saying, is there public transit or is there micromobility that I can use? And this year, what you've seen is a lot of these individuals have said, well, because of the COVID issue, should I own my own vehicle and should I not worry about being a part of the network? And it's those cities that tend to be the trendsetters, and then tier 2, tier 3 cities follow. But at that level, and we're starting to see it seep into other smaller cities, is there is a push for, should you own your own bike? Should there be bike parking? Should we have police walk around to make sure there's not any theft or vandalism of vehicles? I do believe that this is more short-term in nature. I don't believe that this is long-term in nature.
So then a catalyst in the end for shared mobility, right?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, shared mobility wins. And shared mobility wins because I try to dumb it down a little bit, but this framework actually tends to prove itself out. But over rolling periods of time, people will default to the lowest friction and the easiest option. So it's laziness to some degree as humans. And I think that's what micromobility networks offer, provided that they have enough density of vehicles and that these vehicles are maintained, well charged, and well priced. But I don't think pricing is necessarily an issue here.
Right. I mean, this is not necessarily on the subject, but I'm just a fan of this. As the US is a very broad country, has very different cities. Is there a chance that, you know, Elon Musk's robotaxis will make, make Americans give up their own car, just having shared, even for cars? Can it be a shared economy 100% in the future in the US? Would you see that in the 20 years?
I don't think in 20 years you'll see the majority of Americans give up their vehicle. Americans are very proud of owning cars. If you think about the American dream, owning a vehicle and owning your home are the tangible fixtures of the American dream. So I don't necessarily think you'll see that in 20 years. Now, maybe in 60 years, 80 years, it's generational, right? So if my son sees that we do with one car, or we do with having a zip car or car share membership, he'll be more likely to also approach it that way as he establishes his household. And then his kids, his sons and daughters, equally, he or she might also go about it that way. But I think we're a long ways from that. I do believe that something like a Tesla solution to full autonomy, which we're far away from that still, a full level 5 experience, that does set the groundwork for the ability to just have vehicles that are constantly available. So no matter what time of day, where you are, you're able to still have that convenience of access and the ability to be mobile and move.
Right. So you'll still own some cars. I'm an avid driver, to be fair, but I would like to see the future where people are banned from driving on public roads, at least, right? That would help a lot with a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, New York has been playing with, do you open up 14th Street or do you close it off entirely? And they've run experiments where they've made it bike and pedestrian only for a certain section of that. Yeah. I know in Europe, a lot of the large cities, Paris, London, have tried to turn certain sections that are micromobility and pedestrian friendly. And I do think that that's something that you're going to see in larger cities more and more. Because if you think about the age of these cities, they were not originally built in order to withstand all of this traffic. So you'll either see a full ban on traffic, or certain times of day you're able to operate a traditional automobile. I'm not sure if you saw, though, I think earlier this week, France said that they're going to start taxing vehicles over, I think, 1,800 kg. And it's like 10 euro a kilogram over. So that's meaningful. Electric vehicles are not in that legislation, but they're showing you we're going to push you towards vehicles and modes that make more sense in our urban environments. If you need a car, you should be doing city to city drives. That
makes sense. And we've seen an aggressive shift towards improvised bike lanes to support a COVID situation from administrations. And following on this subject, we actually have a question from Alan Clayton, referring to local administrations, I guess. How easy do you think it will ever be to integrate public offerings like bike shares or buses with private, which is cars and mini cars?
That's a really good question. So through our investment in Token Transit, the one thing that we observed as we were working on making that investment is that when Uber and Lyft came through, here in the US especially, so I'll keep this US centric, is that cities and municipalities were caught flat-footed, right? They maintain huge budgets to expand as well as maintain roads, bridges, providing equal access for all socioeconomic groups to travel options. And Uber and Lyft kind of came in and completely messed that up. So now they're trying to be proactive, and they're not necessarily trying to be proactive in the way that they want heavy regulation. They want to be thoughtful and say, how do we partner with you in order to make sure there's not a nuisance? And that's where I think scooter companies benefited, because early on, a lot of them brought in a legal consultant or an investor or a partner that was full time on the management team to help with city relations. And our thesis is that if you're able to give the city the ability to manage the payment infrastructure for public transit, they can then very easily go to the micromobility providers that are coming in who want to work with them, right? They don't want to be banned. We saw what happened when you don't work with a city, but to say, okay, why don't you integrate into our payment network? So it's a better experience for the citizens, but they can now very easily use all the options around them, because there's not the friction of pulling out your phone or your wallet, pulling out your card in order to go from bus to bike to scooter to your vehicle, perhaps. So it'll take some work, but in our minds here, it starts with owning the cash payment, or not cash, but just the payment stream.
Right. And that was a very good question. And we are still waiting for questions from the audience, by the way. But on this subject that you were talking about, so basically it looks like we are going towards more or less unifying different modes of transportation, having a multimodal experience. So basically, how do you see mass players in this game? If we are looking at having unified experiences, we've seen recently that Lime opened up their platform to other players because it's easier for them, as I said publicly, to work with other providers rather than kill them or acquire them. Uber is building on mass, free now as well. And then we have applications, startups that actually started as a mass from day one, like Citymapper and even my own UrbanAir, and also Google Maps, right? Because that has a mass section to it. So where do you see the mass platforms in this whole scenario? Everything is a bit of a mess right now, right?
Yeah. So I think you're going to see a lot of these platforms turn into the integrator, and actually they don't care necessarily what asset you need. They want to best match the asset to your trip need and getting you somewhere in either the fastest period of time or in the least expensive way, right? Depending on who you are, the situation you're in, you have different sensitivities to that. With that, I think in the case of Lime, I think it's very smart that they opened up and they're willing to embrace some of the local players that might be in the markets that they overlap in. You saw here in the US through last year, a lot of the major cities, because there were scooters littered everywhere, right? There was vandalism, there was theft, just general misbehavior. They started capping the scooter companies. Hey, you can only use X hundreds of scooters in my city, and we will think about whether we increase that cap, but show to us that you could be responsible with what we give you. So I think it was Bird who actually came out and said, we will white label and allow you to be a franchisee. Because what Bird realized was, well, we won't have asset availability. We need to have density of assets around the key populations and the key routes, which I thought was very clever, because they're actually inviting independent operators to come in. And what you get as an independent operator is that your asset will show up in Bird. So they're doing lead generation, if you would, on your behalf. But for Bird, they don't have to be necessarily as responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of the assets, which is one of the biggest costs when you look at their unit margins. So I think in a similar way, what Lime is doing is super interesting. And my personal belief is that in areas that involve last mile, you tend to see that there will be players that might own a certain region, but it's very hard to have that national or international presence that's consistent and that's economically viable. So I think Lime can tap into the best operators in the cities they operate in to augment their asset base. Equally, you mentioned Citymapper Google has ambitions here. Apple has ambitions here to supercharge their mapping platforms. I think equally, you'll either see them plug right into the networks themselves or facilitate some kind of a partnership with more local providers. I would assume, though, that in going down that route, they might not necessarily have the full density of assets, because we still shouldn't underestimate the fact that there are so many hundreds of birds, so many hundreds of limes out there in the wild.
Right. So then to summarize, you see this as two steps, if I got it right: trip planning and then integration for payments, right? To have this final solution for the city.
Yeah, or you could go the other way. So
Payments
if you think about, because in my head, it depends on where you're trying to sell into and who you're selling into. But in the US, most cities and small local government, they don't have a way to manage the finances or the payment stream coming through. Oftentimes, they're using an old vendor and a spreadsheet. So that's where we've found if you're able to come in, help them own the payments and open up this multimodal capability, they feel like they're starting to own the mobility experience around them a lot sooner. And you can integrate micromobility, who is very willing and open to engage with city authorities.
So then I would ask you, how do you see it in the future? Is it even more fragmented than today in terms of operators and brands, not necessarily the experience, because we have unifiers for experience, but in terms of actual businesses doing it on the ground, is it going to be more fragmented? Is it going to be a few big players around the world, or maybe just 2 players per city? And also a curiosity of mine, do you think that the state-run operations have a chance in this, or should we ever see e-scooters ran by the cities?
Yeah, I think in the medium term, I would be shocked if there are a handful of players actually servicing the assets, right? I think you will see a world where you have the experience layer that's owned by a few key players, probably broken out by region. So you might have 2 to 3 that own Europe, 2 to 3 that own the US. Asia tends to have their own players, their own ecosystem, but I think similarly 2 to 3 across Latin America. But underneath that, drawing from our supply chain side of things, when you tend to have assets and asset maintenance, everything that is involved with that, especially in this hyper-local dynamic, you'll likely see a lot of these vehicles practically owned and maintained by more local or regional players. So there will be a fragmentation in that part of the stack. Now, what that opens the door for is this could be great for private equity, right? If you're practically operating the assets, maintaining the assets, if you're able to get a platform and start rolling up players and getting operational benefits on the back, that's where I think you really see a capital play, not traditional VC, but our friends in private equity.
Right.
You had a question around cities.
So what about autonomous vehicles and smart cities for the future of mobility?
So cities are undergoing a massive change this year, right? You're seeing entire street blocks that don't have shops any longer. Restaurants are closing right and left. So I think in the near term, cities are going to be focused on stimulating those businesses, Main Street, back, trying to get economic activity. And that's going to put a pause on any efforts there were around the recreation of cities or building the smart city of the future. And the smart city of the future goes hand in hand with being ready for autonomy. Now, the good thing, I think, is they still probably have about 7 to 10 years till you see in the near term level 5 autonomous vehicles going through city centers. You're talking about one of the hardest, most difficult environments, a lot of unknowns, as we call it, for an autonomous system to be able to handle. Might be even longer. And I'm saying that as an investor, right? But it is coming. So I do think it'll happen. But right now, for the next 3 to 5 years, I think cities are just trying to stimulate activity, and then they'll turn their sights to, okay, how do we refocus in and around smart city?
Yeah. We're still waiting for more questions from the public. In the meantime, I'm curious as well, as from an investor perspective. There's a lot of disruption happening, and how are you as an investor looking to profit from the trend? And also, what are you looking at when you're investing in terms of company or founders?
Yeah. So for us, we look at the world through B2B, and we can break it down in a few different levels. So we've been talking about the payment stack, but you have an operational stack. You also have an information stack. The information and data coming off of our mobility habits should not be taken for granted. And in fact, that can actually help you iterate and improve the system faster. The difficult part, and we've discussed this, I think, for the last 5 to 10 minutes, is where do cities come in, right? How do you work with the city? How do you sell into a city? These sales cycles tend to be very different. They are more political because of election cycles. Budgets can be established one year and removed the next year. So it tends to be a place that we have to spend a lot of time evaluating and understanding the dynamics. Given we come in very early as an investor, I think like most seed investors will tell you that the team is 80% of the decision. And we bake that down and distill that into what we call founder market fit. Why does this team have that advantage, insight, and the intangible qualities to go knock down that opportunity and be the winner in this space? Now, we have the benefit that when we talk about things like mobility, there can be several winners, right? These markets are just so large. It's unbelievable. And I think other VCs who are coming into the space or who might be more generalists are realizing that. There's not necessarily a winner-take-all dynamic across the board here. But the next part is the market, right? Understanding not just the size, but the structure. If I need to sell the solution in, I need to get the blessing of these 3 individuals at a city level. Or do I need to go integrate with somebody like an UrbanAir in order to really make this work economically and for my business model to work? And then the last thing is, what have you done so far? Are you might not be generating revenue, which is okay for us at Dynamo, but walk me through how you've used real customer feedback to build what you have in front of you. You're not building just in a bubble. And if you have revenue, that's great. Talk to us about it. How did you get it? How did you work through the sales process?
Yeah, I think mobility is a very, very broad space. It's, for me personally, it's very attractive because I think urban mobility just impacts so much of human life, like even health, real estate, job opportunities, social layers. Everything is impacted by access to mobility. So I think it's a good catalyst. From an investor point of view, I think it's also very highly capitalized. So you're always facing the big guys, which are getting even bigger by the day. So I think it's tricky to be an investor in that space just because of this high pressure in all the areas. But in any case, we'll just take a very short ad break and we'll be back in like less than 1 minute. And we're back. And Santosh, we're gonna start with a question from the audience, which I love. and we will take this answer you'll be having and translating it into Romanian and submitting it to the local mayor's office because we need solutions. And we also have a new mayor who is very open to stuff. So Marga is actually asking, what are the first actual steps a city can make in order to have more shared mobility than owner mobility?
Yeah, wow. That's a loaded question. So I think the first thing it sounds like you might have is somebody who's open and receptive to it. What we've seen is having that openness, that willingness to entertain micromobility is key. If somebody's just not willing to make investments or pull together a partner in order to change the mobility landscape, that's going to be difficult to do. And oftentimes it has to do with, hey, in my prior year, I funded the bus service. So that was, that's what I did under my watch, or we don't have budget to go around. So I think that the second thing also is being clever about it. I think there are ways here that you can get the capital. It doesn't necessarily have to fully come from the city. The city needs to create the appropriate environment. Around the environment, we've had the benefit here. We're in a small city here in the U.S., and they've put concrete barriers and have built bike lanes. And they have clear markings, and it's a rather bike-friendly city. And when we've found city leaders waffle or be hesitant on micromobility, it's because of safety. They think that it's not as safe. Well, you know what? People have been driving about 20% less this year, or through the front half. But kind of incident rates have actually gone up a little bit. They haven't necessarily gone down in vehicles. And understanding that micromobility actually helps the broader stack. So having the data, if you're able to collect the data, gather the incident data, go to an open-minded administration who is willing to be creative and bring the stakeholders around, I think you can get something done. And how you practically do that is that you walk them through that this is going to be a pilot. Let's do it in a small part of the city. Let's make sure that we're responsible about it. Within the success criteria, we make sure that scooters are kept clean off of the roads, they're off of the sidewalks, they're available in the areas we say they will be, they're fully charged, and see how it goes. And then poll the citizens, poll them before, poll them at the start, in the middle, and at the end. And I think what will prove out is that in urban environments, people will use it and will find it valuable.
Right. So it's about just the administration should give support, and companies should be proactive about it. Right. And I think Bucharest, of all cities in Europe, actually, is the one that can benefit the most, even if people don't really understand it, because we kind of have that same paradigm that we love owning stuff. We love owning cars. And then Bucharest is the first in terms of traffic congestion in Europe of all big cities, number one in Europe. That means that the time it takes from point A to point B can be very different in low times and high times. And just that just makes it unpredictable.
Yeah.
And we love owning stuff, and everybody owns cars, and we are the second in the world in terms of home ownership. So we just love owning.
Wow.
Yeah. But I think it's a big problem that we're facing, and people will see that this solution, for me, it changed my life, just traveling multimodal, shared mobility, and not actually driving by car. It just saves so much time. It's incredible. And to be fair, I think ride sharing has contributed to this.
Yes.
Currently, there isn't any capping on that. And of all options you have from going to point A to point B, actually ride sharing is the worst. It's even worse than your own car, because there will still be that segment that the driver is picking you up from, which can be 20 to 50%. And then if it's affordable, then people actually give up public transit in favor of ride sharing. So, and that just adds up so much to the traffic. So I think micromobility and multimodal solutions can actually be a big chance for European cities, for the US cities. In each situation can be a different mix, but it's all about shared, right?
And I would assume over there, similar to the US, like the vast majority of trips are under 5 kilometers, which is about 3 miles or so here, if I'm doing the math right. And it's in those areas where you see the congestion being created. with that if you have a micromobility or a multimodal substitute, you can reduce congestion, free up everybody's time, and it's also a lot less expensive at the end of the day. So there's a total cost equation also that's worth exploring.
Yeah, there was a study saying that central London Uber trips can be disrupted by 75% by micromobility. So you can just switch from that. And it's interesting because you touched upon the point of costs. It can be less expensive. It's, well, in Bucharest, it's actually not because taxis are so cheap. So how do you see the economics of the industry? Will it ever be profitable? And what do you see as the biggest factors in a cost structure that can be optimized? Where can you see the cost going down to, maybe in shared mobility?
Yeah. So probably the biggest knock everybody who was not an investor in micromobility networks had was the unit economics don't make sense. And I think what you've seen is over the last 18 months or so, of the large players have actually pulled back from the small mid-sized cities, that there was not a path to unit profits. Yeah. And what that's actually ultimately identified, roughly speaking, is that you need about 6 months of temperate weather, of relatively warm weather. And I've said before, like, you tend to be around the equator, but that's not necessarily so, because there are other effects of weather, mountains, ocean, currents. But like here in the US, I would generally say the bottom half is great for micromobility and scooters specifically. In New York, you've seen this pocket with City Bike that people will bundle up, the bikes get equipped for the winter, and people will use them even through the cold months. But largely speaking, in the scooter world, you need to have warm climates. So Spain, Lisbon have been great. Brazil has been really great. There have been countries in Asia, and Asia has long embraced forms of micromobility, right? They might be gas powered, but the scooters, the tuk-tuks, bikes even. So Asia has arguably been maybe ahead of this trend. But when you break down the scooters, there's a study, I think McKinsey broke it down, and they think actually from pre-COVID to post-COVID, because city regulations are going to turn more favorable, because this is arguably a safer way of getting around, and that industry consolidation is going to lend itself to pricing power, you might see margins expand from 15, 20% to 20 to 25%. Now, I don't know how true that is. People make jokes about consultants all the time, but that actually makes a lot of sense. If you're able to reduce the regulatory burden and you're actually able to make the assets themselves a little more affordable, there's something here that you will see these providers find the right model. But going back to my previous comment, they're going to tend to own a city or a cluster of cities in a region. And that not necessarily the same thing as being this large company that owns everything across the country or the world. So it might actually end up following a lot of things we've seen in supply chain with last mile delivery. And if you just think of this as last mile delivery of people, there's some parallels here, and we should pay attention.
Right. So we're actually, just for everybody watching us, you're asking questions. Sometimes we touch upon them without actually reading them. So that was a very good answer for Marius Zaharia's question right before, which area of the globe is likely to be already is aggressive early adopter of micromobility. However, Ensar is asking us, the market seems oversaturated with mobility startups, at least in Europe. Many of them shrink their business in the last few months. Will there be another mobility boom in the tech sector?
That's a good question. I don't think that it's going to be either as an operator or an aggregator integrator. I think you're going to see those players kind of continue and see how that shakes out before there might be another boom. But where there is opportunity is in all the picks and shovels, if you would. So I heard, I forget who it was, I think it was Oliver Bruce or Horace Adu at Micromobility IO, but they drew the parallel that the electric motor is to the scooter and the bike as compute and silicon is to smartphones and laptops. So there's still a lot of opportunity, and this gets deep, right? Into improving electric motors, and then thinking about the actual system on a scooter or a bike. So there's certainly ample opportunity there. We looked at a couple startups that help with the autonomous repositioning of assets as well. And the one we spent quite a bit of time discussing here internally. So it's all about enabling and equipping at this point. I think that's where you'll see some more activity, but I don't think you're going to see a meaningful amount of overnight venture-backed startups showing up doing the integration, aggregation, or the network operations piece.
You're maybe referring to Tortoise, was it? The balancing autonomous e-scooters. That's really something. I mean, it's actually happening right now. I've seen it in a few cities. Adriana was asking, well, it's a question for both of us, I guess. How are the rules and regulations of every country or even city impact the balance between shared and owned mobility? And I just, my take on this is that I think even more than ride sharing, this is a subject that the local administration has a lot of control over, and their approach will impact a lot the way the mobility in the city is shaped. And right now we've seen a lot of cities pass regulations, and even our own Cluj in Romania actually passed regulation for shared mobility just recently. And we've seen that there's different approaches in different cities, and you might see a capping of number of companies that can operate in some cities down to 2 or 3. And some other cities, like I think it was Copenhagen, would open up to 10 or 20, just to make sure that they have a lot of competition, as long as they can survive, I guess.
Yeah,
there's different approaches. And Helsinki, also a very good example. They actually made it mandatory for providers to be integrated in mass solutions, because, of course, if it is a public service, people need to have proper access to it. Even in Cluj, they have a similar thing in the newly passed law. What is your take on it?
So I'll pick up the back half of the question. For cities who are not willing to pilot and then institute micromobility networks, you're going to start to see a subset of citizens who, I think, like Mihai, will own their own scooter or their own bike and are more than happy to ride it. So one way or the other, the citizen in most cities and countries will find a way to solve their problem, or so I think. And before it might become a nuisance, or you'll have to think about policing regulation, it makes sense to come to the table and not just say, no, we don't want to do that, or we want to go through all of this process. Just have enough process to try it out and test it. That's easier said than done, right? We're startup people. Cities are not startup people. So they do have certain stakeholders and certain kind of protocol that we just have to be mindful of.
But we definitely saw after the ride-sharing revolution that they are much more attentive, at least, to tech companies trying to disrupt mobility. When Uber was starting up, nobody was actually looking at them until they were too big to be able to be controlled. But now it's quite the opposite, right? You have the first e-scooter company, and then the mayor's office already passes a law. In Romania, they don't usually move so fast, so it's obvious there was an impact.
Yeah.
You guys are actually specialized in supply chain as well. And you touched on the subject a bit just before. Alan Clayton was actually asking a second question from him that he's saying that we invested in Upcycles in New York to try to introduce the micro container. Do you think micromobility as a local delivery or commercial solution is coming? For example, electric delivery bikes, including the post office use, or even micro equivalent of the shipping container, which is very interesting for citywide logistics.
Yeah, no, I think cargo bikes, like whenever I'm out in Europe visiting or have business travel, I'll usually always stop at a post office to watch the cargo bike operations. And it's not normal here in the US. And a lot of it has to do is that we tend to be spread out. While we do have major cities and hubs, a lot of our populations in very rural, remote areas or just less dense areas. But I absolutely think in high urban, high density, high package volume areas, cargo bikes should become a norm. You're seeing UPS pilot versions of this in California. I think they also had a pilot up in Seattle, if I am remembering correctly. So it's happening. To your credit, in Europe, I think you've been ahead of it. It's not novel. It's a part of your last mile ecosystem. On containers, I don't know. I haven't thought about it enough. I think of a cargo bike and your hold as a container of sorts. I don't think you're going to get anything that's remotely the size of a sea container going through a micromobility-esque experience. But I do think because cities are putting in these protected lanes, you can see things that might be remote controlled and over time becoming autonomous in terms of a cargo bike in that bike lane.
Right. So, I mean, we've just been through the first wave of COVID, and that was just a roller coaster, right? Looks like there's a second one coming, but I guess people are more chill about it right now. We kind of found our place in this lifestyle, I guess. But Vladimir is asking, in hindsight, was the logistics tech business as usual during those months, or have you seen some major changes in the industry?
So to make sure I understand the question, has there been any change in kind of seasonality and habits in logistics?
Yeah.
So we have 10 months of data. So I can't say definitively, but if you were to talk to all the large operators, be it ocean, trucking, warehousing, or even the last mile around micromobility, everybody's saying like we're operating like we would during the holidays, during what they call peak season. They said it doesn't feel that different in most weeks, and a lot of it's driven by e-commerce. So you are seeing larger volumes. I do believe that those volumes are here to stay. So we've accelerated the growth of online purchasing and then the requisite online fulfillment. I don't think it's going to go away necessarily. So for now, there has been a meaningful change, but I think we probably need 2-3 years. Once we're through COVID, we have the vaccine distributed, populations have adopted it, to say, okay, what have we gone back to? And only then can we truly tell.
But during these times, I guess there are a lot of opportunities for technology to help the logistics, since they're just operating so differently than a few months ago, right?
Yes, there has been a strong change in sentiment as to how do we buy technology sooner, how do we implement it faster, how do we get value from it faster, or else you're going to be saying no to revenue, or you're just not going to be making any unit margin. You won't have gross margins.
Right. So, I mean, I'm just going to ask you to give your opinion on this. You've just said that Uber also said that they are not expecting to get business back to normal. So how much do you expect that micromobility can actually disrupt ride sharing in the end? I mean, we've had, in my vision, 2019 was the peak. And I always thought it would be the peak anyway, because micromobility just disrupts a lot of the central areas. But how much in the end do you think it will be a split between ride sharing and micromobility, be it owned or shared, I guess?
I think if you think about that, the vast majority of trips by car are for short distances. And let's say kind of 3 miles, 5K or less, right? Even my home, I live in what you'd call suburb or outskirts of the city, and I think I'm maybe six miles away. You can ride micromobility there, and I forget the statistic, but a couple years ago, this was done. This math was done, and I think those short trips, because of the behavior change this year, and people actually experiencing this is faster, this is easier, this is more affordable. it'll be hard to get those trips back when you're ride hailing or thinking about using ride hailing. It's much more efficient to use micromobility. So I do think you'll see some share there that micromobility will keep, shared or owned. I'm not distinguishing that. So I am a believer there. And in regards to where that is relative to 2019 levels, maybe we meet them. Maybe that was not the peak. But these behavior changes, it requires shock, right? COVID, it shocked us as a world citizen base, as people. And now, does that behavior stay with us? It'll be interesting to see. I'm saying it will. It takes like 21 days to make a habit, if I remember right. So why should I think otherwise?
I counted quite a few 21 days since this all started. So based on the data we had from ride sharing in Bucharest, the average trip was roughly 7 kilometers. And, on preliminary data that we have right now on micromobility, it's like 3 to 5 kilometers. So that's kind of too close for comfort, I guess. So from my point of view,
almost there. Yeah. And
we just need infrastructure, right? And we need the support of administrations.
Yeah. And there's also more people are willing to walk, right? I think this year there's been a more of a mindfulness. Instead of sitting in front of Zoom all the time, can I take 30 minutes and walk to get my lunch? So that those 2 kilometers, people could just walk that.
Yeah, exactly. So Monica is also asking, did you see some major changes in customer behavior and mobility patterns during these 2-3 years? And if so, how these changes have accentuated in the last months?
I don't know whether
3 years and then COVID, right?
Yeah, I don't know whether I have the cold hard data, but like anecdotally, whenever I travel quite a lot, I spend half the month usually on the road, and I've noticed my habits changed. And when I was working and visiting other people, we would in San Francisco not get in an Uber like we would have maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We would actually go say, so pull up your Bird app, pull up your Lime app. Could we find a couple and we could take them to lunch or to dinner or to go have a drink? So it has been meaningful. But Mihai might actually have better data than I on that firsthand.
Well, I mean, in terms of ride sharing, at least, the local market has just exploded. The taxi industry, actually, I think we had one of the highest number of rides per person per taxi cab in Europe, just because it was so cheap, and public transit was kind of shitty. That hasn't changed a lot. And then with ride sharing, it became even more accessible. So the market, I think, probably even tripled in the past few years with ride sharing. I mean. And at its peak, I'm guessing it was nearing 1 billion euros a year, Romania alone. So that's
wow.
Yeah, it's because when the state doesn't work, then privates try and solve issues. That's why it's good to be an entrepreneur in Romania. There's lots of problems to be solved.
Yeah.
I was keeping the last question because we have to wrap this up very soon. And I guess it's a bit debatable, so it's a good way to end this discussion. From Ada, she's saying that everybody's talking about the advantages in tech in micromobility. What can you tell us about the security risk that tech is bringing?
Yeah. Oh, it's high, without doubt. If you're not properly securing your endpoints, right? Be it a scooter, be it a connected car. There are bad actors out there who can take control of it and do unfortunate things. I think a car poses a huge safety risk because of its size and its weight, and also the ability that if you can control it, and if it does have an autonomous capability or even a semi or an ADAS functionality, could you do something bad with it? I think naturally, it'll be terrible if something like that happens with a bike or a scooter, right? Because they could still do harm and hurt people. But because they are more realistic for the environment they operate in, right? City environments, going small or short distances, they tend to be less weight. There's less risk there. But I think going into the new year, at least for us, we're spending more time thinking about what is the cybersecurity risk sitting here, and does that require a special solution, or somebody in market going to come and provide that security solution? I don't know yet, but a lot of people are thinking about it, and it's going to be more in the headlines because as vaccines get distributed, how do you secure that? How do you monitor that? How do you make sure that there's no bad behavior going on?
Right. I have seen like a recent article on Tesla, the self-driving feature that they have. There were some, I guess they could be called hackers. They were hacking the behavior of the car using outdoor banners, just putting signs up, and the car was basically malfunctioning in terms of autonomy, and that's pretty scary, right? And that can be an opportunity for investment, I guess, if like special solutions are required. But just having somebody take over, now it's almost 3 tons, right, of a car with the electric ones, and driving havoc. That's a pretty grim scenario. But in general, it's not good to end on a negative note. So I will just say this will never happen in the future because we trust tech and tech cybersecurity solutions, right?
Yeah, we'll get ahead of it. I have confidence that the founders on the line are cued in, and you have a big company potentially there to be built. Yeah.
So just to wrap it up, I would say that I don't know if we answered a lot of questions, and it's definitely there's a lot of disruption happening right now, but I think it's exciting times to be alive, except for maybe the last few months. But in general, I'm positive about micromobility. Would you have like a closing word you would like to address?
Yeah, I think we're super excited as a group here at Dynamo to see where micromobility goes. We think it actually makes the broader system of transit a lot more efficient, a lot more cost effective, and also available to more people, having that essential capability of going from point A to point B. And this year has I think been as a global citizen here has been very different, but I think we'll all come together and end up better for it. So looking forward to that in 2021. Let's see what happens.
It's also positive. Thank you, Bogdan, and thank you everybody for joining us. Hope it was interesting for you guys. That's it from us.
Web Live episode 4. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your questions. I hope you had a good time. See you next time on How to Web Live on the 5th of November. Until then, stay curious.